And now it's time to arch-diapate this week's biggest bogon emitter. And this week it goes to climate scientists. And you may think it's unfair of me to tag all of them, and you'd be right. But the ones we're talking to are the ones being pointed to as representing the consensus of climate science, even though scientific consensus doesn't work that way. Yes, we're talking about them hating on nuclear energy, in particular Bill Gates and his firm TerraPower's Natrium reactors. Natrium is an SMR, a small modular reactor, which outputs about 300 megawatts as opposed to the 1 gigawatt that typical reactors produce. It's also a molten salt reactor, so its safety is completely passive, it's reliable, and it can't melt down because it's already molten. It's safe, reliable, and can produce electricity for about half of what we're paying now, and about a fourth of what so-called renewables cost. I'm including a link to the YouTube video from Illinois Energy Prof on Natrium. Basically, the idea is that these will be mass-produced, installed on site, and then switched out at the end of their life. Their first reactor will be in Wyoming, which is the country's top coal-producing state, so you'd think they'd like this. Nuclear is also the only way we're going to make the Clean Energy Transformation Act's goal of coal-free energy by 2025 and carbon-free energy by 2045. But the climate crazies just can't get rid of their love fest with solar and wind, and sadly, those crazies include a lot of scientists. When the fact is, solar and wind will never be able to be the foundation of a lasting power system, merely a supplement. Because the sun doesn't shine all the time, it gets cloudy, and wind is intermittent and unpredictable. Unlike Natrium, which produces nuclear power at a consistent 345 megawatts, but, thanks to the use of nitrate heat storage, can vary this output between 100 and 500 megawatts as needed moment by moment as consumption varies through the day. If anything, solar and wind drop down exactly when you need them the most. But that doesn't dissuade people like Anthony Froggatt, research fellow at Chatham House, who used to campaign for Greenpeace. Quote, "They aren't that small. This is 345 megawatts. While much smaller than existing reactors, 1,000 megawatts, they are still large and may not be as modular as intended, and this undermines the argument that they can be built in factories and then shipped out, which is how they're supposed to be cheaper." How does that follow? And then there's one of the biggest names in climate science, the darling of the environmentalist movement, Michael E. Mann, he of the hockey stick. This is that graph that shows temperatures being completely flat up until the Industrial Revolution, turning sharply upward at that moment because capitalism or something. Never mind the fact that the actual climate consensus is that the human factor in climate change didn't become significant until the late 1950s. The main reaction other scientists had to the hockey stick graph is, hey, what happened to the medieval warm period? Where's the Little Ice Age? Those are undoubtedly part of our climate's history. But ask that question, and you get called a denialist and all sorts of mean, nasty, ugly things. Never mind the fact that Mann hasn't ever properly published how he came up with the graph. When Mann sued a critic for defamation in British Columbia, the BC Supreme Court threw out the case because Mann refused to turn over his regression data he used to produce the graph. Truth is a defense to defamation in Canada, and the Supreme Court ruled that Mann's refusal to turn over the data after 9 years meant that he couldn't prove that the claims against his graph were false. In real science, you publish the data. All of it, including your regression. You don't hold it proprietary, and you use that data to debunk your critics, not lawsuits. That is very telling for what kind of a person Mann is. You can accept the existence of the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age and still believe anthropogenic global warming is a problem. You can believe that if you're a scientist. You can believe that if you're a rationalist. You can believe that if you're just a reasonable person. But you can't believe that if you're a dogmatist. To a dogmatist, every issue is black and white, and every bit of nuance is the result of dangerous opposition that must be expunged. And Mann is one of the biggest enemies of clean, safe, cheap, carbon-free nuclear power. Of Natrium specifically, he said, quote, It's misguided and dangerous because it leads us down the wrong path. The obstacles to meaningful climate action aren't technological at this point, they're political. Yeah, and you're part of the problem! That's why all those attempts to build nuclear reactors have failed. It has nothing to do with the technology. It has to do with people like you getting in the way. One of the worst is John Haverkamp of Greenpeace. Quote, "Nuclear energy is a diversion from urgent climate action." Geez, do these people have stock in renewables or something? Or maybe they have stock in oil companies, because oil consumption for electricity only goes up as renewables are implemented. Look at Germany's experience compared to France, who decided to go nuclear. He said, quote, "The recent attention on nuclear energy is fully driven by the declining industry's desperation for capital and its related lobby depicting it as a solution for climate change, fully employing the Goebbels stratagem." Quote, "New nuclear power, be it large reactors, evolved from the existing fleet, or new small designs, can deliver only a marginal part of greenhouse gas emission reduction." Well, maybe that wouldn't be the case without nimrods like you getting in the way. It's like shooting a runner in the legs and saying he can't win a marathon. Quote, "It also does so too late and at far too high cost. To make a dent in greenhouse gas emissions, we would need hundreds of new reactors, spreading the risk of proliferation." Yeah, that's always the excuse, isn't it? Nuclear reactors are exactly like bombs, even though they're completely different. Especially molten salt reactors like natrium, which use up all the transuranics so it can't be weaponized. Listen to him shovel it, quote, "The natrium reactor is what we call a fast breeder reactor type. Those reactors are proliferation nightmares. They are delivered together with the reprocessing technology that also is necessary to isolate material for nuclear bombs. For that reason alone, I think the ideas of Gates in this respect are outright dangerous." Oh, where do I start? The whole point of a fast reactor is to burn up nuclear waste. Fast reactors burn up transuranics and result in waste with a lifetime of 300 years, not 300,000. And even that can be reduced with reprocessing. It's that reprocessing that liars like Haverkamp try to make into proliferation. But it's not true, especially in the case of natrium. However, remember he said, "The natrium reactor is what we call a fast breeder reactor type." This is an outright lie. Natrium is not a breeder. The excuses about proliferation made with breeder reactors, which are pretty much bogus to begin with, don't apply to natrium because it uses high-assay low-enrichment uranium, or HALEU. There's no reprocessing, and there's a high burn-up fraction. Haverkamp and Mann and the others are liars, as is Cornell University's Robert Howarth, who calls it experimental even though the technology has existed since the 1960s, and claims, quote, "Today, wind and solar energy are far cheaper, far faster to deploy, and far safer than traditional nuclear plants." When, as regular listeners know, none of that is true. We've covered the hideous human and environmental costs of solar and wind, which the environmentalists just want to ignore. Climate change is an issue we need to solve, but we have the solution. Nuclear power is safe, cheap, and carbon-free, and natrium is a very safe and efficient implementation of it. The only reason to oppose it is political dogma.